63 days since Nancy Guthrie mysteriously vanished from her home in her pajamas without the crucial medication that she needs. One source is now sounding the alarm on the investigator's lack of experience, that shortfall possibly having a negative impact in the early but most critical moments of the investigation. In fact, the supervisor who first arrived to Nancy Guthrie's home apparently had never investigated a homicide before.
My question would be, were you interested in preserving her life at all? Okay, we know there's blood on the porch. We know the door is propped open. We know that she separated from her pacemaker at approximately 2:28 in the morning. The offender or offenders did not choose to take Nancy's health-related items that she would have needed to have survived.
Supervisor who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's house had never investigated a homicide.
We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. But before we get into the new developments, I need you to understand something that has been sitting at the edge of this case since the very beginning. Something that has not been said directly enough. The person who first arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home, the supervisor who walked through that door and made the first critical decisions about how this scene would be processed, had never investigated a homicide before. Never. In a case that would turn out to be one of the most complex disappearances in recent memory. In a case involving a 84-year-old woman, a disconnected pacemaker, a remotely accessed camera system, and what is now understood to be evidence of pre-incident preparation spanning weeks. The first person in charge had never done this before. Tonight we are going through what that meant, what it cost, and where the investigation stands now. Because 63 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished, the question has not changed. Only the weight of it has. Before anything else, subscribe right now. Because in this video, we are answering the one question that has haunted this case from day one. And if you want every update as this investigation moves, hit that notification bell. This case is not slowing down. February 1st, 2026. Tucson, Arizona, Catalina Foothills. An 84-year-old woman disappears from a home she had lived in for years. No forced entry, no broken windows. No signs of a rushed struggle. Just absence. And the last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive was someone she trusted completely. Her son-in-law, Tommaso. That detail alone placed him inside the investigation. But it was what happened after her disappearance, in the days that followed, that made his name impossible to ignore. Because while search teams moved through desert terrain, while helicopters scanned open land, while her family stood in front of cameras, asking anyone who knew anything to come forward, he said nothing. Not publicly, not emotionally, not even in the way people expect when someone close to them disappears. That silence became part of the case. Not evidence, not proof, but something investigators could not dismiss. Because in missing person investigations, behavior matters. And Tommaso's behavior stood apart from everyone else connected to Nancy Guthrie. The final confirmed timeline looked like this. Nancy had spent the evening at her daughter Annie's home. A routine visit. Dinner. Conversation. A few hours together that by all accounts felt completely normal. No reported arguments. No visible tension. At some point later that night, Tommaso drove her home. That part is not disputed. He arrived at her residence in Catalina Foothills, waited long enough to see her enter safely, watched the garage door open, watched her go inside, and then he left. That moment became the last confirmed visual confirmation of Nancy Guthrie alive. Everything after that disappears into uncertainty. The doorbell camera went offline at approximately 1:47 a.m. Her pacemaker, a device that continuously logs cardiac activity, transmitted its last signal at approximately 2:28 a.m. That gap, that 41-minute window, became everything, because something happened inside that house during those 41 minutes. Something significant enough to interrupt both a digital system and a human body. Here is where this case becomes more than just a missing person investigation. Here is where it becomes a story about what happens when the first response is wrong. The supervisor who arrived first at Nancy Guthrie's home, the person who made the initial decisions about how that scene would be treated, what would be preserved, what would be prioritized, what assumptions would be made, had never investigated a homicide before. And one source has now gone on record to say that shortfall may have had a direct negative impact on the most critical moments of this case. The early hours. The hours that do not come back. Think about what that means in practice. When investigators arrive at a potential crime scene, the first decisions shape everything that follows. Where you look first determines what you find. What you treat as significant determines what gets preserved. What you dismiss determines what gets lost. And those early decisions, made in the first hours, sometimes the first minutes, cannot be undone. There were already visible indicators at Nancy Guthrie's home. Blood on the porch, the door propped open, the pacemaker signal gone, her medication, critical medication she needed to survive, left behind. Not taken. Left. One source framed it in a way that is difficult to get out of your head. My question would be, were you interested in preserving her life at all? That is not a rhetorical question. That is a direct challenge to how the scene was initially approached. Because the items Nancy would have needed to stay alive were still in that house. Her health-related items. Everything that would have been taken if keeping her alive was the priority. The offender or offenders did not take them. Which tells you something about what the offender intended. And if the first investigator on scene understood what they were looking at, understood the implications of those left-behind items, the early hours of this investigation might have looked very different. Instead, what followed was a period of wide, unfocused movement. Broad searches, general questions, the kind of response that makes sense in a routine missing person case. This was not a routine missing person case. And the gap between those two things, between what this case actually was and how it was initially treated, is something investigators and sources connected to this case are now being direct about. It is worth stating clearly, this is not about blaming individuals. The officers who responded did what their training and experience prepared them to do. But training and experience matter. And in a case this complex, the cost of that gap was real. The question that follows naturally from this is one that the investigation is still working through. What was missed in those early hours? And can it still be recovered? To understand what investigators are now focused on, you have to understand the environment Nancy Guthrie disappeared from. Catalina Foothills is not an anonymous neighborhood. It is not the kind of place where unusual activity passes unnoticed. It is established, structured, residential in a way where people know what belongs and what doesn't, where unfamiliar vehicles are remembered, where different activity at unusual hours gets noticed, where routine is visible because deviation from it stands out. That kind of environment creates a very specific problem for anyone trying to operate inside it. Because in a place where residents notice everything, the only way to go unnoticed is to belong, or at least appear to belong. That is what investigators began focusing on. Not just who could have done this, but who could have done it without drawing attention. And that question led them to two very specific things: a nearby rental property, and construction activity in the same area. At first glance, those two things seem unrelated. But operationally they share something important. They both provide a reason to be there. A legitimate reason. A rented home provides that. You live there. You move in and out. You are part of the environment. Nobody questions your presence, because your presence makes sense. Construction work provides it too. Vehicles come and go. People move around properties. There is activity at different hours. Workers arrive early. Workers leave late. That kind of movement is expected. None of it stands out. That is what investigators were examining. Not just who could have done this, but who could have done it while remaining effectively invisible. And the rental property raised a specific question, because two competing timelines surround it. One version suggests the occupants left before the incident. The other suggests they left immediately after. Both versions cannot be true, but both versions point to the same question. Why does that property matter? Whether it was empty before or vacated immediately after, it creates a window. A window where accountability disappears. No one watching. No one reporting. No one noticing activity that should not be there. That is what investigators were trying to resolve. Not to confirm what was already known, but to clarify what did not align. And in a case this structured, things that do not align are not errors. They are information. Now let's go back. Because the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance does not begin on February 1st Street. It begins earlier, and understanding that is critical to understanding everything else. January 11th. That date matters. Not as speculation, not as theory, as documented fact. A masked individual appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door, not forcing entry, not attempting to break in, not creating a disturbance. Just present. Experienced investigators describe that moment in a very specific way. A test, not an attempt, and that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this case. Because in planned operations, and this is something investigators understand deeply, you do not begin with the event. You begin before it. You study the environment. You study the timing. You study the response. You learn what happens when you do something small. You find out whether cameras react, whether neighbors come out, whether anyone calls, whether any system activates. You learn the rhythm of the place before you decide to act inside it. That is what January 11th represents. A small action with a very specific larger purpose. Now move forward. January 24th. A second date that investigators have flagged. Not yet fully explained publicly, but important enough that Nancy Guthrie's family specifically asked the public to focus on it. To check cameras. To revisit memories. To look at anything from that day. When a family asks the public to focus on a specific date that is not the day of the disappearance, they are not speculating. They are reflecting something they have been told. That date matters to the investigation. Put them together. January 11th. January 24th. February 1st Street. 3 points. Not random. Sequential. The first appearance. The second alignment. The final event. That is how investigators are now thinking about this. Not as isolated incidents. Not as unrelated moments. But as steps. And steps imply intention. Because nothing about that sequence suggests improvisation. Improvisation is unpredictable. Improvisation creates inconsistency. Improvisation leaves chaotic evidence. That is not what this investigation has found. What it found is the opposite. The same environment, the same location, a consistent pattern of presence, a sequence that builds rather than scatters. That consistency changes everything, because once pre-incident activity is established, February 1st is no longer the beginning. It is the execution, and that changes how every single piece of evidence in this case is understood. Because evidence found at the scene is not just evidence of what happened that night. It is evidence of something that had been building for weeks. Investigators were no longer asking what happened on February 1st Street. They were asking, when did this actually begin? Now return to the timeline. Because time itself becomes one of the most important pieces of evidence in this case. 1:47 a.m. The doorbell camera goes offline. 2:28 a.m. The pacemaker transmits its last signal. 41 minutes. That window does not look large. But investigators do not look at time the way most people do. They look at what is possible inside it. And 41 minutes, when used precisely, is substantial. Here is what that window tells investigators. First, whoever was responsible did not arrive unprepared. Because 41 minutes is enough time if you already know what needs to be done. It is not enough time if you are figuring it out as you go. Someone acting without preparation would waste time. They would hesitate. They would make noise. They would create the kind of disorganized evidence trail that investigations resolve quickly. None of that is present here. Instead, what investigators see is something else entirely. Efficiency. A sequence that does not extend beyond the window. That fits inside it. That uses it. Which suggests that whoever was involved did not need to improvise in the moment. They already knew. Now look at the camera. The system did not fail randomly. It was not a power outage. It was not a technical malfunction. It was accessed remotely using the correct credentials. That detail, that specific detail, changed the direction of this investigation almost immediately. Because it means whoever interacted with that system did not guess their way in. They did not force their way in. They used knowledge they already had. Knowledge of the credentials, knowledge of the timing, knowledge of when to act and how long the window would last. That level of understanding does not come from chance. It comes from exposure, repeated exposure. And repeated exposure connects directly to the January dates. Because if someone was present on January 11th, studying the environment, studying the response patterns, learning the system, then, by February 1st, they were not learning anything new. They were executing something they had already rehearsed. That is the most uncomfortable conclusion in this entire investigation. Not that something terrible happened, but that it was practiced. Now look at what was left behind. No forced entry, no widespread disturbance, no medication taken, no items Nancy would have needed to survive. Each of those absences is as significant as any presence. Because in crime scene analysis, what is not there tells you just as much as what is. No forced entry means access was already established. No widespread disturbance means control was maintained throughout. No medication taken means keeping her alive was not the objective. And that conclusion, that keeping her alive was not the objective, is one of the darkest things about this case. Because it means the outcome may have been decided before that night began. I want to pause here for a second Because if you have stayed with this video to this point, you already understand why this case is different from how it has been covered elsewhere. This channel exists to go through every layer, not the headline version, the actual version. If that is what you are here for, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment below with what you think happened. Because I read every single one. And this case deserves that conversation. Now, the cell tower data. Cellular mapping is one of the most powerful investigative tools in a case like this. And it is also one of the most misunderstood. Most people think of it as tracking, a phone following a person, a dot on a map. That is not what this is. Cell tower data is about patterns. Every phone that connects to towers near a location during a relevant time window becomes part of a larger data set. Not suspects. Not targets. Just data points. And from those data points, patterns are built. Movement paths. Duration of presence. Repeated appearances. Anomalies. And anomalies are what matter. What investigators were seeing in the data from around Nancy Guthrie's home was not just presence on the night of February 1st Street. It was presence on January 11th. And presence on January 24th. Devices that appeared more than once. Devices that were present before the night of the disappearance. Devices that showed up in a pattern that does not match normal neighborhood movement. Because normal neighborhood movement is consistent. People leave at predictable times. They return at predictable times. Their devices create a rhythm in the data that investigators learn quickly. Anomalies break that rhythm. And what investigators found was rhythm breaking, in a very specific way. Devices appearing during the flagged dates. Devices whose presence aligned with the January timeline. Devices that then disappeared during critical windows. And that last detail matters the most. Because disappearance in data is not absence. It is interruption. And interruption is a decision. Phones do not simply vanish from networks without reason. They are turned off. They lose connection intentionally. Or they move outside expected patterns. Each of those possibilities matters. And when multiple devices show similar interruptions at similar times, that stops being coincidence. It becomes structure. At the same time, movement data began to align in a direction that investigators noted early. Devices that were present near Nancy Guthrie's home after the critical window, moving outward. Not randomly. In a direction, away from the residential core, away from the structured neighborhood, toward the desert. That direction had already been identified. And it connects directly to something that has been present in this investigation since the beginning. The question of where Nancy Guthrie is now. Because movement data does not confirm what happened next. But it creates a path. And once a path exists, investigators follow it. Not broadly, not randomly, precisely. At the same time as the cellular work was developing, forensic teams were working through something that is both more definitive and more complicated: DNA. DNA had been recovered from the scene. But it was not clean. It was mixed, multiple contributors. And mixed DNA samples create a challenge that most people do not fully appreciate, because separating individual profiles from a mixed sample is not straightforward. It is not fast. And it is not done by guesswork. It requires time, specialized software, and in some cases, reconstruction techniques that are still being refined in forensic science. This is where investigations slow down. Not because nothing is happening, but because the work shifts from visible action into analytical precision. The kind of work that does not make headlines, but determines outcomes. Now, why does this matter so much in a case like Nancy Guthrie's? Because of where the DNA was found. A controlled environment. A private residence. A home. In that context, placement means everything. Anyone whose DNA is recovered inside that house must have a reason to be there. A known, legitimate, explainable reason. And if a profile is identified that cannot be explained, that cannot be tied to a family member, a regular visitor, a known service worker, it does not just raise a question. It becomes evidence. Now extend that idea to a second location. If DNA from Nancy Guthrie's home also appears at another connected location, the investigative value does not double. It multiplies, because now it is not just placing a person at a scene. It is placing them across a sequence, connecting them not just to an event but to a pattern. And patterns are what build cases that hold. Investigators are not rushing this. That is intentional. Because one mistaken identification, one profile matched before the separation process is complete, can affect the entire case. Accuracy here matters more than speed. A single confirmed profile, fully verified, properly processed, changes everything that follows. It connects the digital evidence. It connects the timeline. It connects the pre-incident dates. It turns structure into proof. But until that happens, it remains what it is: active, progressing, incomplete, and incomplete in a way that investigators are working carefully to resolve. At some point in the early weeks of the investigation, something happened that should have shifted the public narrative. It did not fully do so, but it matters. Authorities publicly stated that the family had been cleared, not partially, not tentatively, cleared, through interviews, evidence review, forensic comparison, including DNA. That is a significant statement, because clearance at that level, with forensic confirmation, is not routine. It requires process. It requires verification. It requires investigators being confident enough in what they know to state it publicly. And they did. But public perception does not follow investigative conclusions in a straight line. Once a question takes hold publicly, it does not disappear easily, especially in a case with this much visibility. Images had surfaced. Photos of Tommaso and Annie leaving their home. He covered part of his face. She avoided direct visibility. Individually, those actions have multiple explanations: privacy, stress, media pressure, grief. But collectively, they created a pattern in the public mind that official statements could not entirely undo. And that is where the investigation split into two directions: the public narrative and the actual investigative work. Those two are rarely aligned. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, the distance between them became significant. Because while commentators were focused on behavior and optics, investigators were working through something entirely different: forensic processing, cell tower analysis, pre-incident pattern mapping, evidence review that had nothing to do with how someone appeared in a photograph. And while that investigation moved forward, the family was doing something very specific. They were asking the public for help. Not focused on theories. Not focused on suspects. Focused on time. Specific windows. January 11th. January 31st Street. February 1st Street. They asked people to check cameras, to revisit memories, to look at details they may have dismissed at the time. Because in cases like this, information does not always come from direct witnesses. Sometimes it comes from someone who saw something and did not realize what it meant. A vehicle parked unusually. A face they did not recognize. A sound at an hour that did not fit. Details that seem small, until they don't. Step back and look at everything that now exists in this investigation. A confirmed timeline that has not changed. 1:47 to 2:28. 41 minutes. No forced entry. Controlled access. A camera accessed remotely with correct credentials. Evidence of preparation across 3 documented dates before the disappearance. A nearby rental property with a conflicting timeline. Construction presence that provided environmental cover. Digital patterns that repeat across January 11th, January 24th, and February 1st Street. Movement data pointing away from the neighborhood in a specific direction. DNA recovered from the scene, mixed, unresolved, but active. This is no longer an open-ended investigation. It is a narrowing one. And narrowing investigations move differently. They slow down not because nothing is happening, but because everything must be right. Because once action is taken, every piece of it must hold. Every timeline, every connection, every profile, every conclusion. That is the standard this investigation is building toward. And the question that now guides every part of it is no longer what could have happened. It is, what fits everything we know? That question has fewer answers than it did 63 days ago. Which means the case is closer. Not to speculation. Not to theory. To resolution. But that resolution has not arrived yet. And until it does, one thing remains unchanged. The same question that has been there from the very beginning. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Because until that is answered, everything else remains part of a story that is still moving toward its final point. Before this ends, there is something more important than any analysis. If you have any information at all, no matter how small it seems, this is the moment to come forward. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. You do not need to have the full picture. Investigators build the case. You provide the detail. A detail you dismissed at the time might be the one that connects everything. FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI. Online, tips.fbi.gov. Total reward available, $1,100,000 to $1 million from the family. $100,000 from the FBI. Completely anonymous. No name, no exposure. Because at this stage, it is not about who you are. It is about what you know. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a person. An 84-year-old woman who was inside her home one night and was gone by morning. And this case is not over. Not until she is found. The investigation continues. Quietly. Methodically. More defined than it was. And when investigations reach this phase, when the structure is built and the pieces are aligning, they do not resolve slowly. They resolve all at once. This channel will be here when that happens. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment below, because the conversation around this case is ongoing, and the people watching it matter. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. And until it is, we keep going.